Our first class last week began with a discussion around the actual mitzvah, the commandment of how we were to do Pesach in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. So it wasn't Pesach then. The goal was that we would take that lamb and slaughter it and use the blood of the lamb to paint the Pesach Habayit, the doorposts of Jewish homes, so that God would Pesach would pass over Jewish homes. And this was the night of the death of the firstborn. And we explored what that mitzvah tells us to do, to take matzah and maror and the sacrificial lamb and the Pesach, which is a reference to the sacrificial lamb, and to eat those three together. And our discussion deepened into an understanding of what each of those experiences are. The Paschal lamb, what kind of energy that has, the matzah and its unique energy, and the maror and its unique energy, and how we are all composites of those parts, and what it is that we're working on and bringing them together in celebrating our freedom. Today, what we're looking at is the Haggadah. Pesach, the holiday of Passover, is unique in that we have a guidebook that takes us through the experience of celebrating the Seder, the celebration of the first night of Pesach, first and second nights of Pesach. And only Passover has this guidebook that leads us through the entire ceremony, so to speak, and the entire celebration, from the Kiddush, from sanctifying the holiday with the Kiddush, into the description of what we will do tonight through the steps of the Seder itself. And as we process through the Seder, what we do in this Haggadah and why this guidebook is called the Haggadah is we will process through the experiences that we had in exile, and how we then were led into a state of redemption. So the Haggadah is based upon a mitzvah, a commandment in the Torah. And the commandment is in the Torah portion of Exodus, which tells us distinctly and specifically, Vehigadeta levincha bayom hahu, on the 14th day of the month of Nisan. On that day, Vehigadeta levincha, you should relay to your child what it was that God did for us in taking us out of Egypt. And therefore, the Haggadah is called the same word, the same root, lahagid, to relay, Haggadita. It's called the Haggadah. It's the book from which we are guided. It's the book from which we will tell this story. But uniquely, the name of the holiday, Pesach, too, is explained by the Arizal and other Hasidic sources to be a composite of two words. The words in the word Pesach, as which we refer to the holiday of Passover, are the words Pesach, which means an open mouth, telling us that the requirement in speaking of the miracles and of the exile that preceded our redemption, the requirement really is to speak aloud with an open mouth. Now, the holiday is called Pesach. We are commanded to speak aloud the events that occurred, our exile and our ensuing redemption. And the Kabbalists teach that we are coming out of an exile that is an exile of speech. Galut hadibur, an exile of speech. And therefore, the way out of exile, we'll explain that in a moment, the way out of exile is through speaking through the experience, which is really very fascinating because part and parcel of the experience of being enslaved is that one loses their voice, not specifically, not directly, but the ability to sound free, the ability to speak with freedom, the ability to say and express who one is, our ability to serve God with freedom and to give expression to that divine service is taken away in a state of slavery, and redemption returns that to us. In fact, the commentaries tell us that this is why Moshe was a kvad peh. He struggled to speak with clarity. One of the understandings is that he spoke with a stutter, and the Midrash tells us that this goes back to the childhood of Moses. Where was Moses brought up? He was brought up in the palace of Pharaoh. How did he end up there? He ended up there because his mother placed him in a basket in the Nile with endeavoring to save his life from the evil decree that Pharaoh had put out, that all male babies are to be drowned, Jewish male babies are to be drowned in the Nile. And so, with an attempt to save his life, which she did, she placed him into a basket, and he was saved from the Nile by the daughter of Pharaoh, by an adopted daughter of Pharaoh, whose name was Batya. When she was removed from the Nile, Batya took Moses home. Miraculously, he had an opportunity to be nursed by his own mother because his sister observed that he was saved from the Nile by Batya. She stood there, Miriam stood and observed that Moses, what would happen with him? She was saved from the Nile. When Miriam observed this, she suggested to Batya that this was a Jewish baby, which Batya understood, and that she would call a nursemaid to feed him because Moses was rejecting feeding by any non-Jewish nursemaid. So growing up in the palace of Pharaoh, Moses was put to a test because the stargazers of Pharaoh experienced an awareness that this child might be one who would want to take over the kingship, take over the land, take over the rulership of Pharaoh. And so Moses was put to a test. And we know the Midrash tells us that he was put before a plate of glowing coals and a plate of gold. Were he to reach for the gold, then his life would be taken because he was a threat to the crown. If he reached for the coals, then they were safe from his potential takeover, this little child who would grow into an adult. Moses reached for the gold, but an angel, the Midrash tells us, moved his hand in the direction of the glowing coals. And as an automatic response to touching something hot, he touched his lips. And when he did so, he developed a disability in his speech. That's the Midrashic story behind the spiritual intention of the difficulty that Moses had in speech. So speech was in a state of exile. And if we dig a little deeper, what we understand is that God created the world through speech with 10 utterances. Those 10 utterances gave creative energy to the world. Enslaved, we lose our creative energy. It was the 10 makot, the 10 plagues, which slowly but surely returned our creative energy to us by way of beginning the journey back into freedom, away from the exile of speech, back into the redemption of speech. And that final redemption was experienced at Sinai, when the Torah tells us that God spoke to us at Sinai. So that final redemptive moment of the exile of speech takes place at Sinai, but it begins with Pesach. It begins with a journey, with the creative energy of the plagues. And then for us, this was God's doing. For us, that redemptive journey begins with Pesach. And the way that we manifest this on the nights of Pesach at the Seder is through relating out loud our exile, the story of our exile, and the story of our redemption, hence the Haggadah, hence this guidebook, or almost like a travel log of our experiences, who we were as a people, what we left, where we came from, and where God took us to. But it's very interesting that once we have said the Kiddush, and we have washed our first hand washing without a blessing. And please, God, our class next week will take us through the 15 steps of the Haggadah, of the Seder, whereas this week our goal is to explore the understanding of what is the Tochen, what is the message that is in the Haggadah itself, what is the context of the Haggadah, and we're also going to look at our fours, because we have a lot of fours in the Haggadah. We have the 4 questions, we have the 4 sons, we have the 4 cups of wine, and all of these fours are part of this journey of from exile into a state of redemption. But when we begin Magid, when we begin the speaking part of the Haggadah, as we begin with an Aramaic prayer. The prayer in Aramaic is the only part of the Haggadah that is in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. All of the Haggadah is in Hebrew, in the holy language, but the first prayer that we begin with, which begins with the words, Hey lachma or halachma anya, this is the bread of poverty, is also understood to mean this is the bread of answers. So we are immediately introducing this process as a process of answers, questions and answers, because the proper way to experience Pesach, the proper way to experience the redemption of speech, is to first recognize that we are suddenly free to ask questions. The inability to ask questions, the confusion that comes along with the experience of exile, whether it's a personal exile or it's our national exile, is that we lose our ability to ask questions. We lose the ability to express what is our deepest quest or what is our deepest concern. We aren't offered the chance, or rather it's taken away from us, to ask God, what's going on? And if we look into the words of the Torah, in fact, we notice that the Torah tells us that the moment, the very second that this experience of breaking this silence began, it was at the moment where we cried out as a nation. We cried out, and God, the Torah tells us, heard our cry. We were breaking through the boundary, that lock on our speech. So, Hey Lachma Anya in the Aramaic, this prayer that begins with the words, this is the bread upon which we will provide answers. There's a very interesting commentary that tells us that the reason that this paragraph that introduces the entire Haggadah is in Aramaic is for a very beautiful reason. When a person prays on behalf of the ill, he should not, the commentaries tell us, pray in Aramaic. He can pray in English, in French, in Russian, in Hebrew, in the Holy Tongue, but he should not pray in Aramaic. And the reason that is given is because when we pray for the ill, it is the angels who carry our prayers aloft. But the angels are not well versed in the language of Aramaic. They are apparently well versed in every other language. but they are not well versed in Aramaic, and there's a spiritual reason for why. So we don't pray for the ill in Aramaic. However, when we sit in front of an ill person, when we visit that person and sit in front of them, then it is okay to say a prayer in Aramaic. And of course, we need to understand this in context. We need to understand this in the context of a people who studied in Aramaic and who spoke Aramaic for many, many, many generations when we were exiled from the land of Israel. So this makes sense in that context. But what we want to understand is why the Haggadah begins this way. But when we sit in front of an ill person, we can pray for them in Aramaic. And bless you. And the reason for this is that above the head of a sick person, the Kabbalists tell us, sits the Shekhinah itself. God's presence sits above the head of a person who is not well. So when we pray in front of that person, we can pray in Aramaic because God has no problem with Aramaic. And so we are expressing ourselves in a language that is free to the healing of this individual. God is right in front of us. When we begin the Seder and we begin in Aramaic, we are making the statement that just as when God took us out of Egypt, and we read these words in the Haggadah, God says, it was I. It was not an angel. It was I, not a malach. It was I, not a seraph, another kind of angel. It was I, not the shaliach, not a messenger. It was I who took you out of Egypt. When we sit down at our Seder and we begin the reading of the Haggadah, we begin in Aramaic to make the statement that it is God who is facilitating our freedom on this night. That the connection that we're making, that the questions that we ask, that the struggles of our personal Egypt are all being addressed directly to God. And that He sits, it is God Himself who sits at the head of the Seder, and it is He who takes us out of our state of slavery into a state of redemption. So we begin the Haggadah directing ourselves towards God. And immediately afterwards, we start with a fourth. We have the 4 questions. In fact, there were once 5 questions asked. The 5th question was regarding the broiling of the meat, or the drying, the barbecuing. How do you say that properly in English? The way that the meat was prepared for the Paschal sacrifice was tli al esh. It was dried over a fire, roasted. Thank you. It was roasted over a fire. We don't ask that 5th question because currently we are not bringing the Paschal sacrifice. And so we ask the other 4 questions. And of course, we know that we are told that the reason that these 4 questions are asked is to engage the children in the Haggadah. But that takes us back to the mitzvah upon which the Haggadah itself is based. The mitzvah of, as we said, V'higadita levincha, on this day you should relate to your child. And of course, the question that arises is, what if there is no child? What if I have no children? What if I am sitting at a Seder where there is no child? What if I don't personally have children? What if I have children, but they are grown and they are not at my Seder? Who is asking the questions? And the answer to that is, halachically, the determination is that there's no child. A husband should ask a wife, and a wife should ask a husband. Then, of course, the question is, and what if there is no partner or spouse? Then one should ask another person sitting at the table with them. But if we recall just a few short years ago, many of us spent Pesach in isolation on our own. experiencing the deepest intention of the words Vihigadata levinecha, and you should tell your child, you should speak to your inner child. And the child who asks the questions then is again our inner child. Our inner child who is experiencing the the set, the conditions of exile, the conditions of Mitzrayim, the conditions of constraint and restriction that we find ourselves within. We mentioned last week that the word Mitzrayim is from the word Meitzarim, constraints. The Alter Rebbe Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains that what our redemptive experience is each year on Pesach, what we're looking to redeem ourselves from, since we're not in Egypt. And this is about Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt, right? We're not speaking about every exile necessarily, even though we mentioned that in every generation, our enemies rise up against us and God saves us. But we are celebrating, commemorating, experiencing a redemption from Egypt. So what's the Egypt for me? The Egypt is my personal Egypt, my personal constraints. And where do those personal constraints begin? The Haggadah tells us those personal constraints begin with a child within us. It is the child within us that experienced one constraint or another as we were developing, and thus we evolved into individuals who have these internal constraints. So when we want to understand what these constraints might be, when we want to give a voice to the child, and again, reflecting back on this idea of slavery, remember that a slave has no voice, but a child doesn't really understand what it means not to ask a question. And we've probably all experienced, whether it's our own children or someone else's child directing a question towards us, the most inappropriate thing that a child might say. But the child has no hesitation in asking the question. And the child will openly and without any boundary or barrier say, why is that person walking funny? Or why is that person in a chair on wheels? Or whatever the many questions that our children might just blurt out, right? And we just want to like cover our faces and hide in shame. Children don't know the constraint of the question. Children don't really know constraint until it's imposed upon them. So the child within us asks 4 questions. And those 4 questions really are questions that talk about the constraints that we experience as individuals, or the potential and possible constraints that we're looking to remove ourselves from, to free ourselves from. So the first of the questions that we ask is, let's first talk about the beginning. How do we begin what is called the Ma Nishtana? Why is it called Ma Nishtana? Because those are the words that we start with. Ma Nishtana, what has changed? What is different on this night from all other nights? And the depth, the inner dimension of that question is, what's going to help me tonight to get out of my personal Egypt? How it is customary to begin these 4 questions with the words, Father, I want to ask you 4 questions. Again, directing our questions straight to God. Because one would say, well, what if I have no father? Do I still say, Father, I want to ask you these questions? The answer is yes. We're directing these questions to God. And so the first of those questions is, why do we dip tonight? All other nights of the year, we dip in anything. But tonight, we specifically dip twice. What is it that we dip? We dip the vegetable into salt water, and then we dip the maror into the haroset, as we'll elaborate on, please God, next week, which is part of the experience of what we do during the Passover Seder. Why do we dip? And the question really is it okay, or the deeper aspect of the question, as the inner child asks of our Father in heaven, is it okay to dip my toe in the water? Is the water safe? Is it okay to be brave tonight? Is it okay to look at what it is I've experienced in my life, even how, and this is, of course, our primary focus, how I have distanced myself from you. Tonight, can I look at this? Can I dip in and be safe in this search? That's the first of our questions. The second of our questions is that all through the year, we eat chametz, but tonight, or matzah, and tonight we eat only matzah. So throughout the year, I don't have to eat only, and let's reference the matzah as humble bread. Throughout the year, I can eat all kinds of bread, leavened breads. But tonight I only eat humble bread. And when we look more deeply at that question of the inner child, the experience, what that question is it safe tonight to be vulnerable? Tonight I remove all ego. Tonight I take away every protective layer. Is it safe tonight to just be humble? Why is tonight different from all other nights? What makes tonight safe? The third question that we ask is why bitter herbs? We eat all kinds of vegetables throughout the year, but tonight we eat bitter herbs. Why bitter herbs? The question, is it okay to look at the scary stuff? Is it safe to look at what exiles me? Is it safe to look at that which keeps me enslaved, which keeps me distant from you? And the fourth question, why every day we sit upright, but tonight we lean? Why do we lean tonight? And again, the question is it safe to just be open? Is it safe to just allow myself to really be completely present in this night, in this experience? God's presence is there, as we said, sitting at the head of the one who is not well. He's sitting right there with us, and we ask these questions even before we begin to speak about what the mitzvah of Magid really is. The mitzvah of Magid is to tell the story. But before we begin, we present ourselves in full vulnerability with an open voice, no longer enslaved with speech, and ask those four questions. And then we begin Magid. We begin to speak about the fact that our forefathers were enslaved in Egypt. And we begin the mitzvah of relating the experience. And as we relate that experience, we say, and if God had not taken us out then, we would still be enslaved. And of course, the question is, really? The Egyptian empire no longer exists. How would we still be enslaved? What does that mean? And again, the reference is to the slavery. Maybe we would not be enslaved to the Egypt that existed then, but it's only by virtue of God removing us from our state of slavery, from that place where we are stuck, that we can actually step into a state of redemption, into a state of freedom, and into a complete relationship with God. What is all of this significance of all of this? The significance of all of this is the realization that the work that I have to do, or the work that I do, trying to separate myself, to heal from those things that have enslaved me, perhaps since childhood traumas, those things that keep my animal soul so intensely engaged. And I fight to engage my godly soul. At the Passover Seder, we recognize that it is only by virtue of connecting deeply to God in our lives that we can fully heal and walk away from an Egypt that keeps us enslaved and into a state of true redemption, into a state of absolute redemption. And we seek throughout the Haggadah to repeat our connection to God over and over again. We talk about our connection, or we reflect on our connection to God. In fact, there's a commentary that teaches that when we read the words of the Haggadah, what we notice is that although in the book of Exodus, in the chapter of in the portion of Shemot, we begin the discussion of exile and the discussion of how we were further exiled by Pharaoh, and then the discussion of how deep this exile became and how harsh this exile became. That whole lengthy, all of those events take place in the portions of Shemot and Va'era and the portion of Bo. All of these chapters, that's not what we read in the Haggadah. Why don't we read those chapters in the Haggadah? Instead, we read an abbreviated version of events that we recite when we bring the Bikurim, the first of our fruits and our crops, to the temple, where we also speak about our slavery and redemption. Those are the verses that we read in the Haggadah. Why don't we go through the whole story? The Torah tells us, V'higadeta levinchat, relate this to your children. Talk to your inner child. Why don't I reread that whole beginning of Exodus? And there are several answers to that. One is, it goes back to the child. The child, whether an actual child or the child within us, doesn't have that great of an attention span. So we keep it brief. Then there's another answer that is suggested, that we're teaching the child to make connections. When the Bikurim are brought, the Torah uses a word similar to the word of V'higadeta, the word Higadeti, Hayom, I have related today. So the Torah is teaching us, or the Haggadah teaches us, to make connections, to remain connected to what our source is. A third reason that is given is that bringing the Bikurim, bringing these first fruits or first of our crops to the temple, as was the custom in temple times, was a declaration of gratitude. And that this should be part and parcel of what we are experiencing, what will schlep us out of our Egypt, what helps us get out of our stuck places, is the recognition of how much we have to be grateful for. And so the focus is not on these lengthy Torah portions, but on the mitzvah that teaches us gratitude. And then there is a fourth reason. And the fourth reason is very curious. You'll remember that we spoke about the fact that God is not mentioned in the Megillah. And we discussed why. Well, you know who's not really mentioned in the Haggadah? Only once, and very casually. One who we would think is a prime character in our redemption, Moses. Moses is only very briefly mentioned, only once, almost in passing, in the entire Haggadah. How is it possible? And what is the intention? Again, the intention is to ensure our connection to God, to notice and to take note, and to be sure and to be secure that we are addressing ourselves directly to God. That I said, God, I took you out, not an angel, not another kind of angel, not a messenger. I took you out. It's your connection to me directly that will help you come away from the places in which you are exiled. Now, if we read the portions of Shemot and Va'era and Bo, all of these portions in Torah, in the book of Exodus that speak about our redemption, there'd be no way that we could leave Moses' name out. Every other verse is, and God spoke to Moses, and Moses came to Pharaoh. Moses spoke to the children of Israel, to the people. So the intention here is all about connecting us to God directly. The connection of transcendence. I'm not connecting to anything that is otherwise available to me. It's a connection that is only to God and directly to God. It is God's promise to redeem us that will take me out of my states of exile. When we address the four sons, again, early on in the Haggadah, the four sons with their four questions of what is it that you're talking about tonight? What is it that you're expressing? What is it that you're teaching? And what is it that you're sharing? Each one of these reflects us, is a reflection of where we may feel ourselves to be in our relationship with God. We may feel close, and yet we have a question. We may feel like we know somewhat of what God has intended for us, but we have a question. We want closer connection. And then there is the son, right, who is just simple. That's us. That's me. I'm sitting here before you, God, in utter simplicity, seeking a connection. Can I too connect? And for each one, there is an answer that speaks to the understanding of connection. And then there's the fourth son. Again, a part of me that doesn't know how to ask. I'm not sure what you want from me. I don't know how to connect. I don't understand. And for this son too, there's an answer. For this son too, put your own words into this son's mouth. Learn, study, experience more deeply. Go deeper. Don't hold back. And so the four sons too are a reflection of ourselves, our challenges, and our experience in connecting to God. And then we have scattered through the Haggadah 4 cups of wine. Now, these 4 cups of wine are not a mitzvah in the Torah. The Torah does not tell us directly that on Passover night, we are to drink 4 cups of wine. It's a rabbinic mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that was instituted by the rabbis, but its placement, the placement of these 4 cups of wine are significant, not only as we discussed last week, that we drink 4 cups of wine in representation of the 4 expressions of redemption that the Torah speaks of, not only in representation of those 4 expressions of redemption, but in the Haggadah, the 4 cups of wine are placed very specifically. So in fact, when we go through the Haggadah, and we begin the Haggadah with the first cup of wine, with a cup of Kiddush, and that begins our Haggadah or our Passover, our Seder experience, the second cup of wine is refilled before we begin the part of the Haggadah that is called Magid. So our first cup of wine is before the Kiddush. And many have the custom where all recite the Kiddush together, whether all recite the Kiddush or only the one leading the Seder recites the Kiddush, and we participate in his Kiddush we all drink that first cup of wine. The second cup of wine is filled before we recite the Haggadah, before we begin saying, this is the bread upon which we have answers. Why? Why here? And we'll answer that in a moment. The third cup of wine is poured before we begin grace after meals. But because we come to a point in the recital of the Haggadah where we pause for the festive meal. So the festive meal on Passover night is part of the Haggadah. We pause to eat that festive meal, and before we say grace after meals, we pour the third cup of wine. And it is with intention that it is there. And then the fourth cup of wine. That fourth cup of wine is poured before we begin the Hallel prayer, our words of praise of God for the redemption from Egypt. We pour our fourth cup of wine. Why in these four places? What is unique or specific or intentional about these four times that we fill our cup? Please God, next week we'll speak about why and when we drink those cups. But why do we fill those cups? And this goes back to the experience of slavery and redemption. A slave faces four dangers. When we are enslaved, whether it is a personal enslavement or whether it is the slavery of the Jewish nation, there are four dangers that we face. One is the danger of spiritual assimilation. So in exile, we face the danger, as indeed we did in Egypt, of being spiritually assimilated. In Egypt, there were those who even had idols in their home. Not everyone left Egypt. Those who had, as the Kabbalists teach us, those who had sunk, so to speak, who had descended into what is referred to as the 50th, the lowest possible state of impurity that a soul can potentially descend into, just as a soul can ascend to 50 levels of purity, or a 50th level of purity to which we ascended when we received the Torah at Sinai. There were those who did descend into the 50th level of impurity in Egypt. Those who left Egypt had not yet degenerated so badly in spiritual assimilation in Egypt. Spiritual assimilation in our personal lives might look like a degeneration in our personal relationships. So the spiritual assimilation in Egypt, although there was spiritual assimilation, we remained safe in a very particular arena. So we did assimilate spiritually, and yet there was one arena of our lives which we kept intact as a people, even while in slavery. And that was the interpersonal relationships between husbands and wives. The men and the women in Egypt, the husbands and wives, retained the purity or the holiness of their relationships. So even while they sank into impurity, into the impurity of the experience of idol worship, they upheld the sanctity of their personal relationships. The second experience of danger in slavery is physical annihilation, is, God forbid, losing one's life in a state of exile. And our history tells us of physical annihilation over and over again. And the experience of what that means, again, going back to our first experience in Egypt, we upheld the sanctity between spouses, but the personal experience of losing, of spiritual annihilation in slavery, or let's bring that into the personal really personal discussion of self and one's own state of Egypt is the suffering that may be experienced in the interpersonal relationships that one has in one's life between husband and wife. Again, going back to the trauma of the Egypt, the trauma of the exile, the trauma of the childhood. What are the things that might suffer? What might suffer is our interpersonal and our closest relationships. What might suffer is physical annihilation, and what might suffer is self-care. A slave cannot care for themselves. Enslaved or in a state of Egypt, personal constraint, we forget how to take care of ourselves. Self-care doesn't mean making time for meditation. Self-care means attending to my soul, attending to my inner self, attending to my core. The third danger that a slave experiences is losing one's history or losing one's sense of history. Interestingly, while we can say this to be true of a state of slavery in general, the Jew has never lost the sense of history. The Jew has never lost their connection. And yet in Egypt, where we were brought into Egypt by Joseph, who was viceroy to Pharaoh, and we came down into Egypt as Jacob's family, over 70 strong, a family that were treated like royalty. With our many years of enslavement in Egypt, we did lose who we were. We lost a sense of who we were. And then the experience of danger in slavery is losing hope. When one is enslaved, one might lose hope. What's interesting in our experience in Egypt is that we did experience the loss of hope. When Moses came and said, I will take you out of Egypt, or I'm coming on behalf of God, and things became worse with Pharaoh, where he worsened the conditions of their slavery, we felt hopeless. But what we did hold on to was a code. There was a special code word that through the generations we were aware of. The words pakod pakadati, I have remembered you. And God said to Moses, go and tell them, pakod pakadati, I have remembered you. I remember my promise to your forefather and to your forefathers. And this code they never forgot. So even while there was a loss of hope, there was a memory of what they should be holding on to. So now let's take a look. We're coming to the end of our class. Let's take a look at the merits that pulled us out of Egypt and how these merits reflect back onto the dangers of slavery. We kept our relationships intact. The Jews did not, with the exception of one that we are aware of, one woman who married an Egyptian man. The Jews in Egypt did not marry Egyptians. They remained loyal to one another. The Jews in Egypt remained loyal. They remained together. They lived together. They remained united. They remained loyal. They kept their Jewish names. Egypt, one of our merits that to leave Egypt, one of the merits that schlepped us out of the impurity was that we kept our Jewish names. And the fourth was that we kept the language of our ancestors. We did not begin to speak a foreign tongue. We continued to speak the language of our ancestors. Each of these merits is reflected in the times when we pour, when we prepare to drink one of the 4 cups of wine. We begin with Kadesh, with Kiddush, with sanctification. We protected the sanctity of our marriages, of our relationships. sanctity. What makes a husband and wife married in Jewish law is referred to as kiddushin, the sanctification of bringing them together as a couple. That's our first cup of the 4 cups of wine. The second cup of wine is the wine of Magid, the story that we tell of who we were. We remained loyal to one another. We did not forget our story. We remained loyal to each other. And at the Seder, we follow through with a mitzvah, with a commandment of Magid to tell that story. The third cup of wine is poured over the merit of keeping our Jewish names. We kept our Jewish names. We did not lose our history. We did not lose the language of a people, keeps the people intact. In fact, very often, if you'll travel, this is a good base example. Whenever I'll get into an Uber, I'll have a conversation with a driver. And if the ride is long enough, so say an airport ride, I will inevitably hear how the driver, who is inevitably not born in America, right, but came to America hoping for better life and better opportunity, right, bemoans the fact that his children are losing touch with and contact with their culture. And inevitably, a driver will say to me, they don't know our language at all. We try to speak to them in the tongue, in our mother tongue. They don't want to speak the language. The language keeps us intact. And so before we say grace after meals, we reflect on, it's a reflection on keeping our Jewish names. How does grace after meals connect to keeping the holy tongue? The holy tongue took us all the way into the land of Israel. When we say grace after meals, over and over we reflect on God taking us into the land. We speak of this good land, God giving us of this good land. V'li Yerushalayim, we then mention Jerusalem in grace after meals. Israel is the land. Today we speak a modern Hebrew, but that modern Hebrew is founded upon those who came into the land and spoke Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. So that children who study Torah in Israel, it's very familiar to them. The language of the Torah of Chumash is very familiar to them. They are learning in their own language. We did not change our language. And finally, I think that was 4, actually. They kept their Jewish names. Right, we were reflecting on Jewish names, which is Beirach. And I suppose the association is similar because ultimately, Hallel, the holy tongue that we speak, when we sing the Hallel, is again praising God for taking us out of exile into redemption, and complete redemption is our redemption into the land of Israel, a redemption into the land with the return of the third temple. So this mitzvah of Magid that we are told, instructed to do in the Torah, in the portion in the book of Exodus, when God said, V'higadata levincha, has a far reach into our own personal exile, into the exile that we live within now, the national exile that we experience, and a far reach into our personal exile. And those 4 ways in which we did not lose ourselves, those things that hooked us out, brought us out of Egypt, 4 merits that brought us out of Egypt, will continue to be merits that will take us out of our personal Egypt and ultimately out of our national Egypt, of our global exile, into a state of redemption, into a state of Geula.